Well, good morning again. Thank you so much for joining us here today. Before we get started with our message, I actually want to draw your attention to the connection card in the seat back in front of you. If you wouldn't mind taking a moment, taking it out and filling it out for us, we'd really appreciate it. On the back, there's actually a place for you to list out any prayer requests that you might have. We at Grace, we take prayer really seriously, and we would be honored to come alongside of you and to be praying for you or a loved one. So if you list those out on that card, you can put the card into the offering basket later on, and you can know that and rest assured that we'll be praying for you throughout the rest of this week. So last week, Tim, he started us off on this new series called Retold, Timeless Stories of Faith from the Scriptures. And I'm excited because I get to share with you the story of Ruth, not just the character of Ruth, but the whole story of Ruth. Now, granted, Ruth is only 4 chapters long, but still, we get to do the whole story. So I'm excited about that. And I actually want to start with a challenge. I want to challenge you to read the story of Ruth sometime this week. If you're a guest and you don't have a Bible, reach under the seat, take one of ours with you by all means. We want every person, I think it would just be so incredible, every one of us read through that story because it's this beautiful, wonderful story that highlights just God's faithfulness and how God's at work. So take a moment this week. It'll take you 15 minutes, read through that story. To get us started today, though, we're actually going to watch a video from the Bible Project. Now, they do a great job of kind of overviewing the entire story for us. They show us what's happening in Israel, what happens throughout that story, and then also offer up a few different insights into what we could take out of that story and apply that to our life. So we're going to start with that, so just sit back and enjoy.
The Book of Ruth. It's a brilliant work of theological art, and it invites us to reflect on the question of how God is involved in the day-to-day joys and hardships of our lives. There are 3 main characters in the book: Naomi, the widow, Ruth, the Moabite, and Boaz, the Israelite farmer. And their story is told in 4 chapters that are beautifully designed. Let's just dive in and see how this all unfolds. Chapter 1 opens with this line, "In the days when the judges ruled," and it reminds us of the very dark and difficult days from the book of Judges. And here we meet an Israelite family in Bethlehem, struggling to survive through a famine. And so in search of food, they move on to the land of Moab, Israel's ancient enemy. And there the father of the family dies, and the sons marry 2 Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. And then the sons, they die too. And so they leave only Naomi and these new daughters-in-law. And so Naomi, she has no reason to stay anymore. And so she tells her new daughters-in-law that she's moving back home. And Naomi, she knows that the life of an unmarried foreign widow in Israel is going to be very hard. And so she compels the women to stay behind. Orpah agrees, but Ruth does not. She shows remarkable loyalty to Naomi, and she says, "Wherever you go, I'm going to go. Your people will become my people, and your God will become my God." And so the 2 of them return to Israel together. And the chapter concludes with Naomi changing her name to Mara, which means bitter in Hebrew, and she laments her tragic fate. Chapter 2 begins with Naomi and Ruth discussing where they're going to find food. And it just so happens to be the beginning of the barley harvest. And so Ruth goes out to look for food, and it just so happens that she ends up picking grain in the field of a man named Boaz, who just so happens to be Naomi's relative. We're told that Boaz is a man of noble character, and he notices Ruth. And so after finding out more about her story, he shows remarkable generosity to her. He makes these special provisions so that the immigrant Ruth can gather grain in his field. And in doing so, Boaz is actually obeying an explicit command of the Torah to show generosity to the immigrant and the poor. Boaz is so impressed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi. He prays for her that God will reward her for her boldness. So Ruth comes home that day, and Naomi finds out that she met Boaz, and she is thrilled. She says Boaz is their family redeemer. Now, this family redeemer thing, this was a cultural practice in Israel where if a man in the family died and he left behind a wife or children or land, it was the family redeemer's responsibility to marry that widow, to take up the land and protect that family. So Naomi, she begins to hope that perhaps there might still be a future for her family. Chapter 3 begins with Naomi and Ruth making a plan to get Boaz to notice their situation. So Ruth is going to stop wearing clothes of a grieving widow, and she's going to show signs that she's available to be married. And so Ruth goes to meet Boaz on the farm that night. And as she approaches, Boaz wakes up and he's totally startled. And Ruth makes her intentions very clear. She asks if Boaz will redeem Naomi's family and marry her. Boaz is once again amazed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi and her family, and he calls Ruth a woman of noble character. It's the same term used to describe the woman of Proverbs 31. So Boaz tells Ruth to wait until the next day, and he will redeem both Ruth and Naomi legally before the town elders. And so the chapter ends with Ruth returning to Naomi, and they marvel together at all of these recent events. In chapter 4, it all comes together. It turns out, at the last minute, Boaz discovers there is a family member who's closer to Naomi than he is, and he's actually eligible before him to redeem the family. But at the last second, this family member finds out that he's going to have to marry Ruth, the Moabite, and so he declines. But Boaz, remember, he knows Ruth's true character, and so he acquires the family property of Naomi, and he marries Ruth. And so just at the beginning, how Ruth was loyal to Naomi's family, so now Boaz is loyal to Naomi's family as well. The story concludes with a reversal of all of the tragedies from chapter 1. So the death of the husband and the sons is reversed as Ruth is married again and gives birth to a new son, granting joy to Naomi. And this symmetry between the opening and the closing, it's even more remarkable. So remember, the opening tragedy was followed by a great act of loyalty on the part of Ruth. And that is now matched by Boaz's act of loyalty that leads to the family's final restoration. And this symmetry, it highlights the design of the internal chapters as well. So each of the chapters begins with Naomi and Ruth making a plan for their future, and that's followed by a providential meeting between Ruth and Boaz, and each chapter concludes with Naomi and Ruth rejoicing at what's taken place. This story is beautifully designed, and that design actually connects with a really interesting feature of the story, and that's how little God is mentioned. Right? The characters talk about God a few times, but the narrator actually never once mentions God doing anything directly in the story, and that's its brilliance. Because God's providence is at work behind every scene of this story, weaving together the circumstances and choices of all these characters. So Naomi, her tragedy leads her to think that God is punishing her, but actually the whole story is about God's mission to restore her and her family. And he's doing so through Ruth, through her boldness and loyalty, which brings healing to Naomi's life, but not without Boaz, who's a no-nonsense farmer who's full of generosity and loyalty. And so God uses his integrity combined with Ruth's boldness to save Naomi and her family. And so this story brilliantly explores the interplay of God's purposes and will with human decision and will. God weaves together the faithful obedience of his people to bring about his redemptive purposes in the world. And that leads to the real end of the story. The book of Ruth concludes with a genealogy, showing how Boaz and Ruth's son, Oved, was the grandfather of King David, from whom came the lineage of the Messiah. And so all of a sudden, these seemingly mundane, ordinary events in this story are woven into God's grand story of redemption for the whole world. And so the book of Ruth invites us to consider how God might be at work in the very ordinary, mundane details of our lives as well. And that's what the book of Ruth is all about.
So it's that line that the book of Ruth invites us to consider how God is at work in the ordinary details of our lives that I'd like to launch us into our message. So I'm going to take the next few minutes to tell you a little bit of the stories from my own life. I've been here about 3.5 months, and most of you don't know me very well. And if you're a guest, you really have no idea who I am. But over the course of the next 15 minutes or so, you're going to know me really well. And I'm not sharing these stories just to tell you about me. I'm sharing these stories because I want us to look at how God is at work in the ordinary details of my life, so that we can then start to think about how could God be at work in the regular, ordinary details of each of our lives. So we're going to use this stage as a timeline. I'm going to start over here. And over here, It represents my sixth grade year. I started sixth grade and I had a teacher who told us that if we joined the band, we would not get extra homework. So I went home and I promptly told mom and dad, I need to join the band. I don't want extra homework. So my parents, we couldn't afford to rent an instrument monthly, so they said, we have this old clarinet of your aunt's in the garage, you can play that. And so God used that ordinary detail of me playing the clarinet later on in my life. We move forward a little bit more, and it's August of 1995, and I'm about to start a high school, and I'm at band camp. And not a lot of guys tend to play the clarinet. And so entering band camp as a ninth grade guy, breaking out into individual instrument groups, that terrified me greatly. You would think hanging out with a bunch of girls would be fantastic, but for a ninth grader, that is like the worst possible thing in the entire world. And so here I am thinking that's what my next hour and a half at band camp is going to be. But as I'm walking over to where we're meeting, another guy walks up to me with his clarinet in hand, and he says, hi, my name's Steve. I see you play the clarinet too. Oh, thank God. I had a friend right that moment, and God used the clarinet to introduce me to Steve. In a regular, ordinary moment, I had a friend, but we move on down the story. And now we're at 10th grade, and Steve, he invites me to a concert. It's September, the concert's in November, and he says, hey, would you like to go? Sure, why not? November rolls around, it's Tuesday night, and Steve calls me up. Hey, that concert's Saturday night. What concert? I proceeded to say. The one I invited you to 2 months ago. You haven't mentioned this in 2 months. I totally forgot. Well, I'm really excited to go. Would you like to stay the night with us Saturday night since we're going to get back late? Steve, I can't go. I have a date. Steve then proceeded for the next 15 minutes to guilt me into eventually saying, fine, I'll go. So Saturday night comes around, and I'm at a Newsboys concert. It was at the Fox Theater in Detroit. And I remember I'm sitting in the front row with my elbows on the stage, and at one moment I turned around, and I saw 1,000 kids jumping, dancing, and singing. And I remember in that moment, I never even imagined that there were 1,000 Christian kids in the world, let alone right there in the Metro Detroit region. So the next morning, Steve's parents, Mike and Sue, they wake us up very early to go to church. I did not like that. I did not like getting woken up early to go to church. However, I really did like the church. See, I grew up Catholic, and so I was used to robes and incense and that workout that they do during the service where you sit, stand, kneel over and over. And so when I went to that church, they didn't do any of that. And I was like, okay, I could get behind this. And then Steve's parents volunteered every week at youth group. And so Sue and Mike made me go to youth group too, and I had an amazing time. And they knew I had an amazing time, and so Sue and Mike proceeded to invite me to stay the night at their house every 6 weeks so that they could bring me to church and to go to youth group the next week. And I just want to stop here for a second. I want to say parents. Parents, you can have such an impact, not only in the life of your own child, but in the lives of their friends as well. Invite their friends along with you. Let them stay the night and come to church. Let them stay for devotions or prayer time, because you could be for them what Sue and Mike were for me. Because Sue and Mike, they became my faith family. They became like a second family to me. We move forward a little bit more. It's now my senior year of high school, and I became a Christian. And Mike and Sue were so excited for me. In fact, I gave a testimony a few weeks later, and Mike and Sue actually sat front and center to listen to me. As time went on, I actually started working for that church. It was called Faith Lutheran Church. And Mike and Sue, they started to volunteer in the ministry that I was leading. They went from bringing me to church, to celebrating my salvation, to volunteering in a ministry that I was leading. Now, it was at Faith that I actually met another guy by the name of Josh. Josh was a high school senior. He was a mentor for my younger brother. And so Josh is mentoring my younger brother, and I would go to check on my brother, and I got to know Josh. Josh ends up graduating, goes to college, and he starts to volunteer in my ministry as well. And as time went on, Josh went off to seminary to become a pastor, and I moved on to my next church, which was Cross of Christ. And I became the director of student ministries there. Now, Josh and I, we would talk almost every single week while he was in school. We would talk about church and starting a new church and what churches should be doing. And Melody and I, my wife, we were going through just crazy times because God was really working on our hearts. He was helping us have a passion and a drive to see lost people connect to Jesus. And Cross of Christ and Faith, they were great people at those churches. But neither one of those churches was doing a really good job at trying to reach lost people. In fact, I shared this with Tim back in April. We had our baptism celebration. I saw more adults get baptized in that one service than my time at 3 different churches serving on their staffs. One service here. And again, God is just working in Melody and I's lives, saying, maybe you guys should move on. Maybe there's more. Maybe there could be something else. So we move forward a little bit more, and Melody and I, we decided to join Josh in planting a new church in Madison, Wisconsin, and so we moved. But a month before we moved to Wisconsin, I got a call from a guy named Eric. Eric was the pastor at a church called Community of Life. Community of Life was the church that was paying Josh to come and plant that church. And he said to me, he said, Pat, I know or I hear that you're really good with the operations for churches. Would you like a job? I didn't know Eric. I didn't know anything about Community of Life, but I knew I needed a job. So I jumped at that. Sure, I'll come on staff. Now, Eric and I, we became really quick friends because we both had a passion to see the kingdom of God expand. We wanted to see lost people reach. And so Eric and I, we served together for about a year before Eric moved up to Green Bay to plant another church. And so at that point, I started running the day-to-day operations for not only the Bridge, which was the church plant we were starting, and not only Community of Life, which was the church that was paying Josh, but also with this new church plant that Eric was working at. And that idea sparked a nonprofit that we started called the 247 Network, where we served to provide operational support for church plants, as well as coaching and mentoring for church planters. So we move forward in our journey a little bit more. And eventually, the church plant, the Bridge, shut down. It just wasn't a viable church. And that hit hard for both Melody and I. And at the same time, God was revealing that where the network was, we didn't need to provide operational support for church plants. That wasn't the need. The need was in coaching and mentoring. And that just wasn't going to be a full-time job. So I made the decision to step back because it wasn't right of me to take a full-time salary when there wasn't a full-time job to be done. And I thought I was done with ministry. I was tired. I was worn out. I thought God was saying, hey, you've served faithfully for over 15 years. It's time to take a rest. It's time to take a seat back. So I hired a business coach, and for 5 months I sent out applications. I did interviews. I got job offers, but nothing was ever a good fit. Nothing ever made sense for our family. We move a little bit forward. And I got a call from Eric one day, and he just said, hey, Pat, are you sure God's done with you in ministry? I don't know. That night, I'm sitting with Melody, and she says, hey, Pat, are you sure God's done with you in ministry? When God says it once, okay, but when he says it twice in the exact same way from 2 different people, I'm going to listen. So I started to pray about it. And it's at that point that I realized that God wasn't calling us out of ministry. He was calling us deeper in. He was calling us to find a good fit. You see, God's uniquely wired me and gifted me in a certain way. And so he was calling me to find a church that would be blessed by that, as well as a church that would be a blessing to my family, that had the same value of wanting to reach lost people that we had. So we move forward a little bit farther in our story. I meet a guy named David from Vanderbloemen's search firm, and he was interviewing me for a position in Oconomowoc, Wisconsin. Spoiler alert, it didn't work out. But at the end of that search, David said something to me. He said, listen, I'm going to help you find the right fit. Then he said this, you were meant for this. It's a regular, ordinary detail, just a regular, ordinary phrase, but God used it in such a powerful way. You see, Vanderbloemen's search firm, they do not exist to find candidates like myself jobs. They exist for the church that hires them. They exist for the church that hires them to find the best candidate for their church. And so for David to say, hey, I'm going to help you, that meant a lot. So we move forward a little bit more, and he sends me the profile for Grace, and he says, hey, look at this one. I think this could be the right fit. I read it, and it literally jumped off the page at me because I was like, this is how God has wired me. What they need, that's what I do. And then I'm reading it, and I'm like, this would be such a blessing for my family. This is just too amazing. So we started the interview process, and we move a little bit forward in the story, and we get to Christmas of last year. And Melody, myself, Oliver, and Sienna, we came here for the Christmas Eve services. Afterwards, we went up to the Staybridge Suites in Merrillville to stay the night. And it was there that we made the decision to make Grace our new church home. We had such peace over that decision. We sold our house in under 6 weeks. We moved. I started here March 1st. And if you remember at the end of April, I gave a message on hypocrisy. What you don't know is that I was never meant to give that message. That was supposed to be Tim Hayward. But Tim Hayward called me and he asked me, hey, could you fill in, again, a regular, ordinary detail that God was going to use? I agreed, and I gave that message. If you remember, I started talking about labels, how we're all given labels or we receive labels, and how the impact that they could have on our life. A few weeks go by, and I met someone in the lobby who said to me, hey, your sermon really impacted me. That idea of labels, I'm actually going to use that with my students. She was a teacher. I'm going to use that because I want them to see the labels that they have or that they give themselves and how they can be used for good. I want them to have healthy labels in their life. And again, it was a regular, ordinary detail that God used because it was in that moment that I knew that God had me exactly where he wanted me to be. So what does all of this have to do with the book of Ruth? Well, if you remember, the book of Ruth, it invites us to consider how God is at work in the ordinary details of our lives. And I look at my story, and I look at each of those details, and by themselves, they're not that big a deal. Lots of people play the clarinet. Not as many guys as girls, but lots of people play the clarinet. But God used that, and he used people to impact my life. He used ordinary details. I look at them, and I see God weaving this amazing, beautiful tapestry. I see the highs and the lows. I see the ups and the downs in my life. But through all of those moments, I see him, and I see how he's working. I see the author and the perfecter of my faith at work. And it brings me to this point on June 24th, 2018, where I get to stand in front of you. But without Steve, without Sue and Mike, without Josh, without Eric, without Melody, without David, without Tim, I wouldn't be here. God is at work in the ordinary details of our lives. We may not know how or why or what he's doing, but he is doing something. I guarantee you he is working. He was working in the life of Naomi. He was working in the life of Ruth. He was working in the life of Boaz, and he is at work in your life. And with that thought, I want to share 3 questions that I think will help us interact with this story of Ruth a little better. These are 3 questions that we could ask ourselves to see what God's doing. So the first question is this: what has God done in my life? What has God done in my life? And honestly, I think this question, it's just meant to help us look at our own story, to look at the people or the places or the things that God has done that have impacted us. Big things, little things, it doesn't matter. God's at work, and it's looking at them, at that story, that helps us recognize it. I know some of us, we might be going through a tough time, and when we're going through a tough time, it's really hard to pull ourselves out and to look back. But I want to encourage you to do that. If you're going through a tough time right now, look back at what God has been doing. If for no other reason than to see that he is faithful. He's faithful and he's at work. The second question we can ask is, what is God currently doing in my life? What is God currently doing in my life? And this is about us just trying to pinpoint, to look and self-assess and say, God, what are you up to? What's happening here? I've got this situation, whether it's good or whether it's bad going on. What are you doing with this? I'm sure multiple times in the life of Ruth, she had to stop and say, God, what are you doing right now? I lost my husband. What are you doing? I'm following my mother-in-law, which, mind you, I would never do. She followed her mother-in-law to another country to live with her. God, what are you doing? That does not sound like fun. She continues on. She's hungry. God, what are you doing? She meets Boaz. God, what are you doing? And I love this in the video. It says that at that one moment, Ruth goes to Boaz, and she says, will you redeem my family? And it says, afterwards, Ruth went back to Naomi, and they marveled in all that God was doing. That's what this question's about. It's about giving us the opportunity to marvel in all that God is doing right now in our lives. And the third question we should ask ourselves is, am I open and willing to follow God to whatever he might call me to do? Am I open and willing to follow God to whatever he might be calling me to do? Ruth was willing to follow God. It says in the story that when Naomi sent her back, she said, no, no. Where you go, I will go. Your land will become my land. Your people will become my people. Your God will become my God. Ruth was willing to follow God. Are you willing to follow God? Wherever he might be leading you. Would you be willing to follow him to Africa, like Sherry Foley, who ran 56 miles to raise awareness and money for World Vision and children in need? Would you be willing to follow God to Indonesia, like Jack and Angie Hamster and their family might be, to serve in the aviation missions ministry? Maybe it's local. Would you be willing to follow God to help out with the foster care system and Royal Family Kids Camp like Crystal Van Newland? Maybe it's right here at Grace. Would you be willing to follow God to get baptized on July 29th when we have our baptism celebration? Would you be willing to follow God to maybe just take a leap of faith to learn a little bit more about grace at Grace 101? The truth is, I don't know what God's calling you to do. I don't know how he's asking you to follow him. But I do know this. I know that Naomi was willing to follow God. I know that Ruth was willing to follow God. I know that Boaz was willing to follow God. And because they followed God, they had a son named Obed, who had a son named Jesse, who had a son named David, that we refer to as King David. And if we continue down that line, we get to Jesus himself. You see, God is at work. He's weaving this beautiful, this amazing tapestry. And he's weaving you and I into it. This isn't my story. This is his story, and I get to be a part of it. He's the one doing this. He weaved Ruth, a Moabitess, who didn't even worship our God, into the lineage of Jesus because he is working. My challenge to each of us today is 3 things. 1, read the book of Ruth. I already gave it to you. 15 to 20 minutes, I promise. Fantastic story. Second challenge, ask yourself these 3 questions. What has God done in my life? What is God currently doing? Am I open and willing to following him? And the third thing I want you to do, be bold and share it with someone else. Share it with a friend. Share it with a neighbor. Share how God is weaving you into his story and what he's calling you to do because of that. Share it with us here at Grace, office@connect@grace.org. Send us an email with that. Post it on our Facebook wall. If you know what he's calling you to do right now, if you know what your next step is, write it on your connection card. We want to be praying for you, and if we can come alongside of you, we want to. We want to help you take whatever that next step is with Jesus that he's calling you to take. The book of Ruth, it invites us to consider how God is at work in the ordinary details of our lives. And I'm standing here today to tell you that God is at work in the ordinary details of your life. Join me in a word of prayer. Father, thank you for being at work in each and every one of our lives in some way. Lord, we know you are faithful in all things. And today we ask that we would see what you're up to in our lives. Lord, reveal that to us and help each of us to be bold enough to follow you in that next step. No matter what it might be, we ask that we would have the strength and the courage to step out in faith, to trust in you and in the story that you're writing that we get to be a part of. Amen.